Imagine standing in your parents' dining room, pie in hand, and hearing your own mother introduce you to a room full of relatives as the maid, and then laugh like it's the best joke she's ever told. That's exactly what happened to me on a Thanksgiving night I will never forget. My name is Jasmine Fitzgerald. I'm 30 years old, and what unfolded at that table changed the way my entire family sees me, and the way I see myself. I'd walked through that same doorway every Thanksgiving since I was a kid. This time, though, something felt off before I even sat down. The good china was out, the set my mother only used twice a year. Every seat at the table was taken except mine. My sister Whitney sat at the head, her white doctor's coat draped over her chair even though we were nowhere near a hospital. She liked people to notice what she did for a living before she said a single word. I set my store-bought pie on the counter and squeezed into the last open chair beside my Uncle Roland, who barely looked up from his phone to nod at me. 14 people packed that dining room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my parents, Whitney, her fiancé, and me. I remember counting every one of them, because counting was easier than sitting with how I actually felt. Then my mother rose, wine glass in hand, and tapped it with her fork the way she always did before a toast. The room hushed instantly, the way it always did for her. She looked at Whitney with a proud, glowing smile, the kind she never once aimed at me, and she said the words I will carry for the rest of my life. One daughter is a doctor, the other is a maid. Then she laughed, genuinely, easily, like she'd just delivered the punchline of the century, and the table laughed right along with her, all 14 of them. My face burned, but I said nothing. I gripped my napkin under the table while my aunt patted my mother's arm and added, "Well, someone has to clean the houses," and a cousin snorted into his mashed potatoes. My mother never corrected herself, never apologized. She just kept going, gushing about Whitney's residency, about how she'd always been the smart one, about how she was going to change the world one patient at a time. Nobody in that room mentioned that I owned my own house cleaning company, that I had 4 employees on my payroll, that I'd bought my own townhouse at 26 without a cent of help from anyone at that table. To my mother, none of that counted. To her, I was simply the maid. I sat through the rest of dinner in silence, pushing food around my plate, while Whitney described her rotations, and my father nodded along like she was reciting scripture. Every so often my mother's eyes would flick toward me, waiting for me to laugh too, to prove I could take a joke, that I wasn't too sensitive, her favorite label for me whenever the truth got uncomfortable. I forced a smile, the same smile I'd been forcing at that table my whole life. Dessert came and went, and I let myself believe the worst was over. Then my mother stood again, glass raised, and my stomach dropped before she even opened her mouth. A second toast to Whitney, as if one humiliation hadn't been enough, as if the room needed reminding exactly where I ranked in this family. She started the same way, praising Whitney's brilliance, her sacrifice, her dedication. Whitney's fiancé beamed like he'd married into royalty. My father lifted his glass along with everyone else, ready to toast my sister's greatness a second time, while I sat there invisible, exactly the way my mother had always made sure I felt. But this time, something inside me finally cracked. My hands started shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to 30 years of pressure finally reaching its limit. My mother lifted her glass higher, drawing breath to begin her second toast, and the room fell silent the way it always did when she spoke. Every eye in that dining room turned toward her, and that's when I stood up. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't rehearsed a single word, which was strange for me, because I usually rehearsed every conversation with my family long before I ever walked through their door. My chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor, and for the first time all night, every head at that table turned toward me instead of her. My mother froze mid-sentence, glass still raised, mouth still open, waiting to hear what her maid daughter could possibly have to say that was worth interrupting her moment. I looked her straight in the eye, and finally said what I'd swallowed for 3 decades. "You can keep toasting Whitney all night if you want," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "but you don't get to call me a maid at my own family's table and then act surprised when I stop showing up to it." The room went completely still, not the light, awkward quiet that follows a joke gone wrong, the kind of silence where you can actually hear the refrigerator humming through the wall. My mother's glass hung in the air, frozen, like she'd forgotten she was even holding it. Whitney's fiancé stopped mid-bite. Even Uncle Roland set his phone down. My mother blinked at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a language she didn't understand. "Jasmine, it was a joke," she said, forcing out a thin, brittle laugh. "Don't be so sensitive." There it was, the line I'd heard my entire life, the one that had always worked, the one that used to send me sinking back into my chair, apologizing for daring to have feelings. Not this time. "It wasn't a joke," I told her. "You've called me the maid in front of this family for years, and everyone laughs because you laugh first. I clean houses for a living, Mom, and I built that business from nothing. I have 4 people on my payroll. I bought my own home at 26 without a dollar of help from you or Dad. But none of that matters to you, because I'm not the one in a white coat." My father cleared his throat, mumbling something about me overreacting, so I turned to face him too. "You raised your glass right along with her," I said. "Both times, and you didn't say a word either time." He looked down at his plate like it had become the most fascinating object in the house. My aunt tried to smooth things over, insisting that families tease each other and I shouldn't take it so personally, but I held my ground. "There's a difference between teasing and humiliating someone in front of 14 people, I said, and every single one of you laughed. Nobody had a response to that. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, as 14 people who'd been laughing minutes earlier suddenly found their plates and napkins far more interesting than looking at me, or at my mother. Then, to her credit, Whitney set down her fork. She looked genuinely shaken for the first time all evening. "Mom, she's right," she said quietly. "That wasn't okay." My mother's head snapped toward her, stunned, as if she never imagined her golden child would break formation. "I love that you're proud of me," Whitney went on, "but you've done this before, and it's not fair to Jasmine." My mother's expression cycled through embarrassment, shock, and defensiveness in the span of a few seconds. "I didn't mean it like that," she said softly, but the joke had already left her mouth. The laugh had already happened, and you cannot take back something 14 people heard and laughed at together. I didn't cry, even though my eyes burned. I didn't raise my voice either. I simply picked up my purse from the back of my chair and said, "I love this family, but I'm done sitting at a table where I'm the punchline every single year. When you're ready to introduce me as your daughter instead of the maid, you know exactly where to find me." Then I walked out of that dining room, out of that house, and into the cold November night. And for the first time in years, I actually felt like I could breathe. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my car. Messages poured in from cousins I hadn't spoken to in months, admitting they'd always felt uneasy about how my mother talked about me but never knew how to say anything. A voice memo arrived from my aunt, apologizing for laughing along, confessing she'd felt sick the moment I walked out the door. Even Whitney called that night. Not to defend our mother, but to tell me how proud she was that I'd finally spoken up, and that she intended to have a real conversation with our parents about how they'd treated me for years. My mother called 3 days later. She didn't apologize right away, but she asked if we could finally talk, really talk, about what had been happening at every holiday gathering for years. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale resolution. There were more difficult conversations after that one, and there were moments where old patterns tried to creep back in. But something shifted permanently the second I stood up from that table. I stopped playing the role of the family's quiet punching bag. Slowly, I became someone they had to actually reckon with, instead of someone they could simply laugh at and move past. If you've ever sat at a table where the people who are supposed to love you most made you feel small, I want you to hear this clearly. Speaking up doesn't make you dramatic. It makes you free. Standing up for yourself, even shakily, even without a script, is never overreacting. It's reclaiming the respect you should have had all along. If this story hit home for you, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this deserve to be told and heard, and there are so many more on the way. Subscribe today, and let's make sure nobody ever has to sit in silence at their own family's table again.